A physiological approach to fatigue management. My name is Dr. Mike Wahl. I have a PhD in medicine and am the co-chair of the Human Performance and Safety in Extreme Environments diploma program at Memorial University. I'm here speaking on behalf of Medicis Health Group today and going to be talking to you a lot about some of the real-world practical experience that we've encountered in our work in heavy industry and how human physiology plays a big role in how we should be controlling the risk of fatigue in the workplace. The first thing I'll give you is a scenario of how this really became to the forefront in the work that I was doing in the offshore Newfoundland. Is that in the offshore of Newfoundland, the weather is quite tricky. And the other thing is that a lot of people that work in Newfoundland work offshore, but then live not in the urban centers, but in the rural centers. And so as a result, when somebody is going to catch a flight, what they may do is they may get up at, say the flight's at 6 a.m., they may get up at 2 o'clock in the morning, drive 3 hours to get to a heliport, check in, and then from there, wait for their flight. Now, the likelihood of that flight going on time may not be that high because of weather conditions or sea states or any number of factors, including wind. And so that individual may be sitting around a heliport until it's about to get dark later on that afternoon. So they may be up from 2 o'clock in the morning until a flight leaves at 4 p.m. When the flight leaves, it leaves at, say, 4 o'clock and could travel 2 hours to go offshore. And at that point, when they get offshore, they may have a couple hours to settle in and then have to go directly onto night shift. And that is a very common scenario. And what happens to that individual is at that point, they've been up. By the time they get into the bunk the next morning, approximately 30 hours straight, and the risk of that for themselves and for other people in their operations and their tasks is significantly higher than it would be if they were well rested. And so part of this presentation is looking at the different defenses an organization should put in place if they've got a population which is susceptible to fatigue and it may impose safety risks or even risks to their well-being. So let's walk through this now and see what some of the challenges are that occur with people when they're in a fatigue state. So that worker that is up for 30 hours straight and is coming back after 3 weeks off mentally may not be 100% in the game, thinking about his family at home and adjusting to the fact that they've got 3 weeks of night shift ahead of them before they get to go home and see their family. That individual has a bunch of things happening physiologically. First of all, they've got reduced decision making. They've got reduced ability to plan the job. They've got reduced communication skills, reduced attention and alertness, poor judgment, increased risk taking, and they can experience what are called micro sleeps, which is when you nod your head and you fall asleep for just a few seconds. You can have decreased reaction time, a failure to respond to the environment, reduced coordination, reduced eye tracking, and reduced steering and tracking. So if you think about that, that individual may not be as familiar with the job. They're coming into a new job they've never experienced before because they're doing a different operation. And then all these deficits are occurring at exactly the same time. And the magnitude of these deficits are dependent directly with how fatigued the individual is, let alone the chronic fatigue that they may be experiencing from poor lifestyle behaviors or poor sleep hygiene. You can see how this could be a recipe for disaster if organizations don't address it. So what is fatigue? Fatigue is a state of feeling very tired, weary, or sleepy, resulting from an unsatisfactory sleep, prolonged mental or physical work, or lengthy periods of stress and anxiety. Those all sound like ingredients that occur in high-stress, high-performance, safety-sensitive environments. Acute fatigue results from short-term sleep loss or from short periods of substantial physical or mental work, and chronic fatigue syndrome is a continuous, severe state of tiredness that is not relieved by rest. Our body works on what are called circadian rhythms. And circadian rhythms are the natural progression of energetic responses throughout the day that increase from waking in the morning until rest at night. And while you're asleep, your circadian rhythm should be its lowest. Somebody who's on night shift, for example, will and lives a normal schedule when they're not working, for example, and is awake during the days, they'll be competing against this because what they'll be doing is they'll be working when they're most drowsy. So if you think about this, at 6 a.m., what happens is melatonin, which is a hormone which helps us sleep, stops being released. You start your day, and sunlight tends to help and increase this awareness. And then you have highest alertness leading up from mid-morning until lunchtime. One of the things that circadian rhythm works on is the pineal gland in the brain is able to sense light. This is why a bird will start chirping first thing in the morning when the sun starts to rise. It's exactly how our brain works. So if we sense light, it starts to increasingly steadily wake us up, and then at noon, We have high levels of energy, then followed by the fastest reaction time and the best coordination, and then leading into 6 p.m. or so, our body starts to drop in energy levels. Lights start to get a little bit lower in the horizon, so the sun isn't as strong, and then our body starts releasing melatonin. As the evening rolls on, and in the middle of the night, we should be having restorative deep sleep and REM sleep. So circadian rhythm is a bodily rhythm that's cyclical and occurs every 24 hours. It increases alertness and performance during the day and drives us to sleep at night. This is how it looks. So if you look at different hours here, the red line represents alertness. You can see that we are most fatigued at like 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the mornings when we're the most drowsy, and as the day progresses, it goes as a wave. That little dip that we see mid-afternoon, that's our post-lunch dip, and that's because our body is storing the energy from our lunch and tends to have two gears, either on or off. So when the body's storing, it tends not to expend energy, and when it's expending energy, it tends not to store energy because it's liberating the energy. If we look at this and then we correlate how traffic accidents work directly with it, you can see that there's a direct inverse relationship between accidents and the circadian rhythm. So, for example, the time of day, the dark shaded area in gray there, indicates the amount of traffic on the road. And the traffic almost completely mirrors the circadian rhythm. And that makes sense because as people wake up and the typical person gets their day going, there's more vehicles on the road. And then later on in the evening, the number of vehicles drops until it's the lowest around 3 o'clock in the morning. Well, that's the same thing that happens with our drowsiness, is it follows that same rhythm. Our circadian rhythm follows that same traffic rhythm. The reality is, though, if you look at accidents and the relative risk, both of these are working in direct opposition to our circadian rhythm. And so what that tells us is that an individual may be driving in the middle of the night and there's the least amount of cars on the road, as opposed to the middle of the day when there's the least amount of accidents and the most amount of cars on the road, is that they're more likely to get an accident at that point. And that's because fatigue is kicking in. There's not the inherent risk of other drivers or other vehicles or speeds and bumper-to-bumper traffic. It purely is typically associated with the fact that the individual is tired. And so these are things we can't deny in the literature. And if you look at clock times and you look at the accidents, injuries, and fatalities, you see that these are highest in the earliest hours of the morning, and they're lowest during the busiest times of the day. And it's kind of interesting when you see that the 5 p.m. and 6 p.m. traffic have some of the lowest times of the day when it comes to accidents, injuries, and fatalities. WorkSafe BC had research that showed the number of hours awake can be similar to blood alcohol levels. And they showed that 17 hours awake is equivalent to blood alcohol content of 0.05, 21 hours awake is the equivalent of blood alcohol content of 0.08, and 24 to 25 hours awake is equivalent to blood alcohol content of 0.1. And so our concentration starts to drop, our information processing is dropping, our coordination, our eye movement and control, our tracking, steering, all those different things that we talked about with the rig worker that had been up for 30 hours. These are all things that are occurring here. So if you're up for 24 hours straight, it's basically the equivalent of being impaired by alcohol, but you might be on the job, and somebody may not pick that risk up because it's not as obvious to say alcohol or drug use. If you look at hours of wakefulness and sleep deprivation, what we find is that the longer somebody's awake, the poorer their performance is. And if we look at the sleep deprivation line going down here, we see it's a pretty linear response that shows the longer you're awake, the poorer your performance. And if you correlate that to alcohol, you're going to see that the relationship is very similar. The scale is slightly different on the side, but in general, what we find is that an individual who's been awake for over a day is the equivalent of being very impaired with alcohol. Let's look at a few industrial accidents. For those of you who haven't seen the miniseries Chernobyl, you'll know that one of the things that occurred is that it happened in the evening time. They think operator error was a big part of it. They think fatigue may have played a role because of the rolling shifts. 3 Mile Island happened at 4 a.m. and again, operator accident was considered the cause of that, and they associated fatigue with it. If you look at the Gulf War, the first one, half of the friendly fire deaths were due to fatigue. And the scenario we talked about before was the offshore. What we found was there was potentially several accidents that were associated with fatigue, And as a result, the CNLOPB, which is the Newfoundland Offshore Petroleum Board, mandated fatigue awareness and fatigue management plans to be implemented at all industrial sites. There was flight delays with high cancellations and stress with travel going offshore. There was smaller accommodations on older rigs with older crews, lack of sunlight, a cold environment, and traditional shifts where they would do short changes, for example, and they would go from days to nights or from nights to days and only have a 6-hour gap between, which is extremely tough for an individual to cope with when they're looking at a change over that short period of time. We looked at the supply vessels that were offshore where they had small POB. They did a lot of sitting around when they weren't doing offloading operations and lots of cancellations. And as a result, the onshore mandated that the offshore had to be safe. And so the research that came out, and I was part of the advisory board looking at a lot of the offshore safety, and the research showed that the longer the isolation for an individual, the greater the risk. The layover days add significantly to fatigue, and so whether that be layover days traveling to and from a location or layover days when somebody is delayed getting home, so if their mind was on traveling and they were supposed to be home, well, that next day caused an exponentially increased amount of stress and fatigue for that person because they were already supposed to be planned to be home with their family and friends. The level of job exertion relates to fatigue. The perception of fatigue increases the job demands. So, for example, if you think you've got a very tough job that you think is grueling and fatigue has been something that's characteristic of that position and you've almost conditioned yourself to believe that, it actually makes the job harder. So getting ahead of these things with proper communication and having the right plans is a very effective way to be able to mitigate some of the perceived fatigue associated with the job, which translates to relative real fatigue. Day shift workers find activities become easier over time, and night shift workers find activities become harder over time. However, injury occurrence is less in 12-hour shifts versus an 8-hour shift, which is an interesting scenario. Most people think that the longer somebody works, the more likely they would be to be fatigued, but in general, what they find is injury occurrence happens less because individuals are able to really get in the groove with the position when they're doing a 12-hour shift. And rotating shifts, like short changes, where people go from days to nights with a very short layover time between, has a negative impact on fatigue as well. And so working with some of the oil and gas operators, what we developed was a theoretical model that you can please apply within your organizations as a way to be able to put in barriers and control against fatigue-related incident. And so what we put together was 4 different defenses, and we had goals, actions, and merits for each one of them. And we'll walk through each one of these, but if you can see that the first aspect is about increasing sleep, and the second part is about increasing, defense 3 is about increasing alertness, and the fourth one is about having learning and defense around that and being able to learn as an organization. And then at the bottom, when we look at the metrics, we look at the root causes and fatigue analysis. So there's lots of things that we're going to go through here, but if you take it from this approach and see whether or not your organization is setting up the appropriate defenses against fatigue, I think you'll be significantly ahead of the game. The first defense is you need to provide sufficient sleep opportunity. And so planning, scheduling of shifts and rotations. So if you take the example of the individual that's coming in after getting up early, going to a heliport, waiting to catch a flight, and then going directly on shift, we would log the individual's sleep prior to arriving at the establishment, and then the organization would put somebody on shift when they were able to achieve sufficient sleep. So they may not be going on until the last 2 hours of their shift because of the schedule arriving. And so there was this planning scheduling that was very key. Individuals were able to report. They were aware of indicating they needed to indicate how much sleep they had so that they could report to the bunk and then get the sufficient amount of sleep and then come into shift when they were physically capable of doing that. Planning and scheduling of ad hoc crews and vendors, making sure that individuals that are supposed to be there are there at the right time so that operations are going fluidly. That's an important aspect of it. And also having people that may be able to supplement in and work while other individuals are recovering and resting. We have to consider things like overtime and how frequently individuals are allowed to do overtime to ensure that they are provided sufficient sleep opportunities. So, for example, if somebody has the opportunity to work a lot and they're trying to make money, and so they do their regular shifts and they're doing a tremendous amount of overtime, and you're just allowing to do it because you're shorthanded, well, that individual may only be allowed to get 4 hours of sleep because they're literally working 20 hours a day. That's the type of behavior that has to be monitored because you're not serving that individual well at all for their long-term health, but also for their fatigue risk. And then doing a fatigue risk analysis. And that's really important as well, to be able to actually have some metrics around, like, okay, how at risk is the individual that is about to go on shift, and how much sleep have they had, and then how long will it take them to recover from the fatigue that they've accrued over this period of time. And so for shift scheduling, for example, we used to put a limit on the work hours within a 21-day period. So we would do 21 days times 12 hours per shift, and individuals offshore weren't able to do more than 252 hours without getting sign-off from a supervisor, and that supervisor would be monitoring and ensure that that individual was able to get sufficient sleep. Handovers for continuous shifts, in addition to normal shift maximum, there was they would also, before the 12-hour shift, they would actually make people do a handover meeting prior to, it could be up to a half an hour. So that was limited to 10.5 hours per rotation. So that means that over that 21 days, they were never allowed to do more than a half an hour of handovers. That could be before and after the shift. Planned maximum hours of work was 12 per shift. For people that were off rotation, if you were off rotation, you had to be off of work for at least 21 days. Before coming back, and if you were delayed arriving back at the heliport, there was exceptions made, or there was documentation of how often this individual was coming back on a shorter than normal rest period. Overtime hours, they would do 2 hours with a max of 4, and then they would have to have sign off again on this, and then look at like a maximum of days per rotation, which was 21 days. Of course, in certain environments where weather's a factor and traveling on and off a site, that can sometimes be difficult, but they tried their best to get to that. And so what they would do is they would ensure employees have adequate time away from the workplace each day. And what we did was we made sure that these complied with labor laws and regulations in our province, and so you had to do that in your respective province. Consider specific roles and tasks when planning the employees' schedules. So when you were doing a particularly fatiguing job, we know that the job demands either the perception or the physical or the mental component of it can increase fatigue. So being conscious of just how demanding are you making the job. So a 12-hour shift, which is relatively sedentary, is going to have a markedly different effect than a 12-hour shift, which is very physical or very stressful and it requires a lot of vigilance. And so keeping that in mind is important. So 12 hours isn't 12 hours. It depends on the nature of the job. Communicate expectations with employees about making sure that they have to follow the fatigue management process, and interpret fatigue risk assessments when planning staffing levels, experience, expertise, and opportunities for job rotation. And here's some of the things that fatigue actually affect in us and that actually amplify fatigue. So for example, if there's physical and mental effort, doing repetitive or monotonous work leads to significantly more fatigue. Having sustained effort or having a complex task also does. The work environment, things like adverse lighting conditions, or adverse conditions like environmentally, cold, dark, windblown, you name it, being in the bottom of a mine, for example. Adverse conditions like that make a difference. The lighting makes a difference. The types of lighting that we use can cause fatigue. Climate, the time of day, and then the accommodations themselves. And people might laugh when they think that we actually looked at the type of mattresses that are in the room for the bunks, because we wanted to make sure that individuals were able to sleep on a comfortable surface, and we made sure that there was blackout blinds in the room so the light didn't creep in, and made sure that there was curtains on the beds to be able to create darkness if a roommate was coming in and out of the room. So there's lots of things that can be done that way in the accommodations. For lifestyle, there's a lot of things around nutrition and stress management, and now with the CSA standard for psychological health and safety, there's that can be implemented. Smoking status makes a difference, age makes a difference, and sleep hygiene, which we'll talk a lot about today. Obesity level makes a difference for sleep because it can lead to things like sleep apnea, but it can also affect our metabolism. It can impact the hormones that give us energy and allow us to be tired. And also our physical fitness. The stronger our structure, the more quality rest we're able to get. You can have pre-existing illnesses, like a cardiovascular illness. You can have an anxiety disorder, which obviously affects our sleep disorders, and an injury which causes physical pain, which keeps us awake throughout the night. For the working schedule, there can be long hours in a single shift or long hours across a roster cycle, which lead to fatigue. There could be long hours of on-call duties, short breaks between work shifts, short breaks within work shifts. The start and finish times makes a difference, and changes in rosters. And one thing to evaluate is it why are we starting our jobs at 6 a.m. if that's one of the highest fatigue times when it could easily be 7 o'clock on some operations? If you look back at the oil and gas industry, one of the reasons why shifts started at 6 a.m. was because that was 8:30 or 8 o'clock in the morning in New York City when the wells were being drilled in Texas. And so the business people were coming to their offices in the skyscrapers while the people had to report to work to have the phone calls with them for the morning call at 6 a.m. And so there's a lot of things that occur that we don't actually know why they occur. They just happen, but physiologically they don't make a lot of sense. When we talk about fatigue factors, they've done some studies, and these were done in the North Sea in the Mariner studies. And what they found was there was cognitive failures, perceived fatigue, and fatigue risk factors. And an odds ratio is a 1-to-1 odd is a 50-50 odd. In other words, like a 50% of chance of winning. So it's just equal. Anything above that increases the risk. Anything below it is protective against something. So if you see an odd ratio of 2, that means it's twice as likely to occur as opposed to the opposite condition. So when we look at tour length, we see that up to 7 days increases fatigue, but the longer the shift, up to 28 days, actually is protective for people. It's when it goes further than that it starts to become more risky. So then we look at the shift, and we find that the shifts that are 6 hours to 12 hours on, they increase the risk of fatigue, but then there's irregular splits that also cause a risk to it. When we see things for boats, when they are switched to port work, they find that this work is more fatiguing. When the sleep quality is lower, fatigue risk increases. When physical hazards are higher, fatigue risk increases. When environmental factors are louder and colder and harsher, fatigue risk increases by 68%. When job demands are higher, fatigue goes up. When work stress is higher, same thing. When somebody's married versus being other or single, the risk is higher because they have that stability, which helps with stress levels. When their education is higher, they're protected against fatigue, and when they are younger, they're protected versus older people. But when you're an officer, you see that the risk is higher than if you weren't an officer. So there's a lot of things that play a part, and this is why it becomes so important that individuals are educated about the risk factors that are inherent to them, the type of job, the type of circumstances. So if somebody's doing a very complex task, it's very hard conditions, they're doing it during a longer shift, they're near the end of their 28-day rotation, these are all times that somebody could be more susceptible to fatigue, and that could be that tipping point that goes from being able to do the job appropriately to not being able to do the job safely. If we look at Defense 2, this is when we sort of, in Defense 1, given the opportunity for good sleep, but we haven't necessarily ensured that proper sleep is occurring, and that's Defense 2. So the first thing, ensure sufficient rest is obtained, optimization of the work and rest in the sleep environments, education and training, putting wellness programming in place, and doing individual risk assessment and self-assessment. And these are the assessments that I spoke about earlier. So sleep hygiene is the first thing. Rest is the most important control measure for managing fatigue. If you give somebody the opportunity to go to the bunk for 8 hours a night, it does not necessarily mean they're sleeping. They may have any host of things that keep them awake that night, and therefore they get no sleep and come to work just as fatigued as they did before, even though you gave them the right shift, you gave them the right opportunity for sleep, you gave them all the opportunities and processes and policies that you need to ensure fatigue wasn't happening. Well, that's what a lot of organizations do. They stop there. Now you have to go deeper and make sure that individual has the tools themselves to ensure they have the right sleep. So sleep hygiene is really critical, and you can educate people on these different things, and things like go to bed on time and go to bed at the same time and get up at the same time and keep a regular sleep schedule that way. A lot of our phones will have apps these days that allow us to shut all the alerts down and shut our phone down at a certain time and have an alarm that wakes us up and be able to track our sleep habits. Those are all really important. Make sure that people aren't watching TV. That's what I mean by bed is mostly for sleeping. TV watching and staying and playing video games and things like that are going to increase blue light exposure, which actually wakes our brain up because it perceives the lights from electronics to be like sunlight. Those are all things that are really bad for us directly before we go to bed because they wake our brains up. So if you're not sleepy, don't try to go to sleep. Just work over time until you get closer to your sleep time, and then you're fatigued when the sleep time hits, and then you can go to bed at the right time. But sitting there and tossing and turning is actually a way to be able to stay awake because it's tough. So you turn off your text and ringers. You don't need to know anything that's going on in the world while you're asleep. You can figure it out when you get up. Ask family members to be respectful if one person is sleeping. If you're in a house that tends to be loud, just work on that respect. And same thing with your roommates. If you're sharing a room at a site, that's another thing that people can do is educate people about a respectful workplace and making sure that one person isn't blaring the TV while another person's trying to sleep. Make the room as dark and as quiet as possible. So having the TV on in the background is not good for us when we go to sleep. Maybe having some white noise or some calming music or some nature sounds, those things are okay for certain people if that's something that they enjoy. But in general, making the room quiet and dark are really important. And most people sleep better when the room is cool. So try and keep the temperature from being too warm. If it's too hot, that can be a way to stay awake. Another thing you can do is you want to make sure that even when you think you're asleep, are you actually getting good sleep quality? So sleep apnea can occur when we actually stop breathing. We hold our breath for short periods of time, and it can happen literally tens of times per minute. When people have sleep apnea. So there's a couple questions you should ask yourself right now, and if you answer more than 3, then go see your doctor and say, look, am I maybe not getting the right amount of sleep? And you'd be shocked that maybe you have sleep apnea and you haven't been sleeping at all for the last little while, and you can get that addressed and fixed. That can make a huge difference in your overall quality of life. But if you answer yes to 3 or more questions, these are the ones you should speak to your doctor about maybe looking into testing you for sleep apnea. Number 1, are you overweight? Yes or no? Do you snore loudly when sleeping? Do you ever choke or gasp at night? Have you been told you hold your breath or stop breathing during sleep by somebody else? Do you feel excessively tired or sleepy during the day? Do you frequently toss and turn and have a restless sleep? Does your throat feel dry when you wake up in the morning? Do you have high blood pressure? Do you wake up at night and feel your heart thumping, sometimes with an irregular heartbeat? Or do you wake up in a heavy sweat? So if those answer 3 or more of those, then maybe it's worth going to see your physician and just seeing whether or not you may have sleep apnea. Because if you do have it, there's lots of simple ways you can fix that, and it can make a tremendous difference in your overall quality of life and your sleep quality. Next thing you look at is education. So you have to provide your employees with an education program of fatigue management. You want to educate them on recognizing and properly reporting fatigue in the workplace and in themselves and with others, and allow people to have those conversations openly that somebody may be fatigued. You want to allow employees to participate in fatigue risk assessments, and you want to offer supplementary information on nutrition, exercise, illness, injury prevention, etc. And so with that, if you're providing food to your employees because they're on a site, for example, and there's less people on at night, what typically happens is there's less healthy options available for that night shift, which isn't fair to them for being on a night shift. So ensuring that there's the same type of quality options for healthy foods at night are really important. And we'll talk a little bit more about nutrition. We'll talk about the role of exercise. And how they all sort of lead into it. Now, there's a thing called sleep inertia, and sleep inertia becomes really critical when somebody is literally getting out of bed and going directly to work because they live and work at the same place. And so one of the things I've seen in mining sites and in remote sites is that individuals can wake up and they can literally be on the job in less than 5 minutes. And there's a thing called sleep inertia. And sleep inertia means that we're not fully awake yet. You don't really know how you got downstairs. You just were groggy and you're waking up, and you can break sleep inertia quite easily by doing a stretching and warm-up program. You can also increase reactivity, increase blood flow, wake the brain up, let the body know what's going on, allow proprioception so your body knows where it is in space. And so what you'd want to do with that is, and people call these all sorts of things stretch and flex or whatever, but you don't want to be looking at holding long stretches and doing like really deep excessive sort of end of range of motion type activities. What you want to do is you want to do active movements. So you'd start with your feet and you would do like ankle rotations, and then you would do some body weight squats, and then you do some twisting side to side without overexerting, of course, in any of these movements that would cause aggravation. Then you take your arms like this image right here and you go back and forth, and then you turn your head side to side and go ear to shoulder. And there's lots of different ways to get the blood moving, and what you're doing is you're not trying to make the person more flexible, you're just trying to wake those cold stiff muscles up, and in the process your heart has to beat quicker to pump blood to these active tissues, and that wakes us up and breaks sleep inertia. That's a really powerful one. On top of that, warm-up programs are extremely important when done properly, and the right types of stretches are implemented at reducing soft tissue injuries as well. So let's talk about nutrition. There's a few things that are really important when it comes to nutrition. Number one, understanding the foods that we eat and how they impact our body. We know that proteins help build stronger cells. We know that carbohydrates give us lots of energy, and we know that good healthy fats like oils and nuts, what they do is they help our cells conduct energy in and out of them. So that's the first thing, is educating people on the proper food so that they're eating the right type of things. Having lots of sugar causes sugar highs and sugar lows and leads to drowsiness, while having a well-balanced diet with the right types of nutrients at the right time will give people sustained energy and allow them to build their body and recover and have a surplus, and therefore increase their metabolism, which will combat fatigue. Additionally, when people are at night, they can benefit from having smaller, more frequent feedings. So they could have their couple small meals, but lots of healthy snacks in between. And they also benefit from having a higher protein content at night because there's a higher thermic effect, which allows our body to sort of stay awake and work a little bit harder at digesting these foods. So there's lots of tips and tricks that you can do from the nutrition side of things. But first of all, instilling that somebody is having a well-balanced diet is the first thing. Offering those food choices to people if you're the food provider, or if you've got a contractor that provides the food, ensuring that they have a truly healthy menu for people, and giving people that are on night shift and day shift an opportunity to indulge in those healthy foods, as opposed to having a bad option in the evening and lots of great options during the day, which doesn't help the opposite shift. In addition to that, educating people on how to snack properly later on at night to keep sustained energy and keep that metabolism elevated. It's also important for people to understand how much food they need depending on their profession. If somebody is an athlete or a hard physical job like a miner or a lumberjack, or working in a tough manual job, you can see the kilocalories need to be around 4,800 for a man and 4,250 for a woman, while a bookkeeper is half of that for a man and half of that for a woman. And so people have to realize that, okay, I was a physical job when I was a scaffolder, and then I became a planner, and now I sit at a desk all day long and I supervise the operations, but I don't actually do the work anymore. Well, people have to tweak their energy intake depending on that. So people matching their energy intake with their energy expenditure is important. Somebody who is a hard physical job and doesn't eat enough will experience fatigue, but somebody who has a low physical demand but eats a ton of food, in particular high sugar foods or high calorie foods, will have these periods when their body is saying, I have too much energy, I need to shut down to store this energy to get it in my bloodstream, and so they can experience these huge post-meal dips. And these are the things that you want to try to avoid. So educating people that we all eat differently. A bigger person needs to eat more than a little person. Men have to eat differently than women. People on night shift have to eat different than people on day shift. People with physically demanding jobs have to eat different than people with sedentary jobs. And that they're all equal, but they're not the same. But people have to be cognizant of where they fall on that spectrum. When you look at a plate, it's real simple. You can teach people things like 30% of your plate should be protein, 30% carbohydrates, 30% vegetables, and then you got 10% fat. And that fat could be in the protein through fish, or it could be on the salad with olive oil, or on the vegetables, or it could be on a piece of toast in the form of peanut butter in that carbohydrate section. But people just have to recognize, when they look at their plate, they need to have a diversified plate of nutrients. So they need to recognize and know what a protein is, what a carbohydrate is, what a good fat is. And this can be times when your wellness program really kicks in play and starts taking that wellness information and applying it directly towards health and safety. And really, there's no better place for it than under the health side of the health and safety. So use this as an opportunity to educate people on food. They may learn something new that they can apply in their daily life. It may help them with health conditions. It may help them with weight loss, or may help their family in helping their kids eat healthy as they grow. All are relevant challenges for people, but ultimately poor nutrition can translate to fatigue, which can affect us. You can also address mental health. Addressing mental health is an extremely important aspect of fatigue management, because one of the reasons people can't sleep at night is because they have stressful life circumstances, or an inability to cope with it, or they have a diagnosed mental health condition. All of these things are very serious and very real, and organizations that are proactive in assisting these workers that have these challenges will better be able to prepare them to handle this stress, and also mitigate the risks that are associated with it, because somebody may not be open about things if you don't have an environment that's reducing stigma, and therefore appears to be getting a regular amount of sleep but really isn't getting any, and then one day an accident occurs and you find out in a retrospective analysis the individual really wasn't getting sufficient sleep. And so there's a couple new things. I talked about it earlier, but the Psychological Health and Safety System, or standard, which has been put out by the CSA, is a great framework that organizations can use to start to protect the psychological safety of their workers. There's mental health first aid programs, there's EAP programs at your organizations, there's peer support programs, which are very valuable when it comes to remote sites. There's lots of online tools where people can get therapy and counseling, and advice remotely these days when it looks like they're just on their phone, checking their social media. And there's also benefits programs within companies and insurance where people can go avail of preferred providers for psychotherapy or psychiatry or social work or whatever their need is. And these are all ways that we can address mental health within our organization. Exercise is a critically important aspect of maintaining a healthy body and a healthy sleep cycle, in particular for people that have sedentary jobs or even people with physically active jobs. It's a way to be able to combat those overuse aspects of their job and well round their fitness level up because they may be doing things that are very repetitive in nature. But exercise helps improve sleep, it increases energy levels, it reduces muscle tension, it reduces stress, it improves muscle tone and strength, increases aerobic fitness of your heart and lungs, it reduces body fat, it improves bone density, it increases stamina, it improves circulation with better digestion and bodily functions. It does a whole host of things, and there's different times a day you can exercise. In general, I would say exercising at any time is better than not exercising at all, but exercising directly before bed sometimes can increase alertness in people. And so, finding a time that's not directly before bed, if possible, is sometimes the best. But besides that, I encourage exercise whenever people can get the opportunity to do it. It doesn't have to be for a long period of time. Short bursts of exercise, from even 10 to 20 minutes, have shown tremendous benefit for individuals. And so, encouraging people to start small is great as long as they're getting down that road. A thing that's a real nemesis for people these days, in particular in Canada, we drink a lot of coffee. There's lots of ways we can ingest caffeine. Instant coffee, drip coffee, espresso all have a lot of caffeine. Caffeinated beverages like energy drinks these days are very popular. A lot of sodas have caffeine in them as well. And then you see things like green tea and normal tea, both of which have quite a bit of caffeine too. And so there's lots of ways people need to be aware of this and maybe take in their caffeine in the morning. But as the day progresses, stop taking in as much. If they're on night shift, same thing. They stop taking it in 6 to 8 hours before they go to sleep. These are all ways to be able to control it so that individuals aren't being over-caffeinated and then wondering why they can't sleep. One of the ways to stay alert that doesn't require caffeine is through hydration. Most people don't realize that, number one, the most confusing signal our body has with hunger is actually thirst. So a lot of people think they're hungry, but they're actually just thirsty. And that water actually increases our alertness to a greater extent than caffeine in most cases. So it increases alertness, it lubricates our joints. None of us are getting younger. It regulates our temperature in our body through sweating. And you think every time you see your breath and you're breathing out in the cold, that's moisture leaving your body. Every time you're sweating, that's moisture leaving your body. It aids with weight loss. It helps to regulate bodily functions. So what I would do is limit your daily intake of caffeine and then drink your 2 liters or 8 glasses of water each day. If you're a bigger person or a smaller person, doesn't matter. Start there and sort of go up from there. And that will make a huge difference in your overall thing. For a lot of people that have restless leg syndrome, that don't sleep well at night, a lot of the reasons why they have restless leg syndrome is because they're dehydrated. Another thing is that their muscles aren't being used enough in an appropriate way or stretched, so physical activity also helps mitigate that. There's other risk factors like alcohol, smoking, personal illness, and over-the-counter drugs. And these can all activate our nervous system. But when we're fatigued, we're more susceptible to falling prey to our nervous system. So if you think about every great duo on TV, you've got a really sort of animated and then a really sort of calm. So you've got like Kirk and Spock and Hermione and Ron and Sherlock Holmes and Watson and Fred and Barney. And there's typically one sort of calmer person and then one person that's kind of freaking out. And that would best be described like the parasympathetic nervous system. There's an interplay in our body. There's a calm and there's a fight or flight. And so the parasympathetic nervous system, you can remember rest and digest, while the sympathetic nervous system is fight or flight. And so what it does is when we have a sympathetic nervous system, think about our favorite sprinters at the starting line about to start a race. Their pupils dilate so they can see better around them. They inhibit salivation. They increase their heartbeat to be able to prepare blood to be shuttled to active muscles. Their airways relax to allow to get more oxygen in, because that's what our body works on when we're running. Our stomach shuts down because we don't really need that. Our kidneys and our liver start to stimulate the release of glucose, inhibit the gallbladder, and inhibits intestines because we don't need to digest food. This is why when you start exercising and going for swimming after you're eating, you'll get cramps because your digestive system shuts down and you're shuttling all that blood to muscles. It increases epinephrine and norepinephrine. which are neurotransmitters. It relaxes the bladder. It also affects our sexual system because, again, our fight or flight system would be activated during something like intercourse. When you look at parasympathetic system, it's the complete opposite. You see constricted pupils. We see saliva stimulated, our heartbeat slows, our airways constrict, our stomach activity increases. It stops the release of glucose because we're going to be getting into a store kind of rest and digest situation. It stimulates the activity of the intestines, and it contracts the bladder and goes from there. If we look at the next thing, we're going to be looking at what happens with individuals when they start to have different stress responses. And one of these things you'd see would be a more regular change in how somebody becomes alert. So, for example, when somebody gets a stress response to a situation, or they're fatigued, or they're hitting this parasympathetic nervous system is inactivated, what you find is, if you look at the beginning here, respiration is relatively random, heart rate variability is random, blood pressure rhythm is kind of all over the place. And what that means, like, for example, heart rate variability, what means is that our heart will beat 60 beats a minute, for example, but it doesn't care how it gets there. So when we're just at relaxed state, it goes beat, 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 beat. It doesn't really have a pattern. But the second our parasympathetic system is activated, what happens is our brain says, okay, we need to make sure the blood arrives. We need to make sure our breathing is regulated. We need to make sure our blood pressure is exactly on point, because we're going to need all these physical systems to deal with this fight or flight response. So this is what happens after quick coherence. When somebody has a stressful event, we notice that respiration, heart rate variability, and blood pressure all get much more synchronized, and they become much more regular. And that means that our brain is taken over. And if somebody is being exposed to this fight or flight or this stressful type situation a long time, this is very hard for the body. This isn't a natural state. Our body wants to just go on cruise control. But if our brain takes over, this is challenging, and it can lead to increased fatigue. And so what you need to do at that point is, you've tried to control for things through policies and mandating the proper shift schedules. You've tried to educate people on how to have better sleep behavior, but now you're into Defense 3, which says you need to have sufficient alertness behavior. And so this is self-assessment for fatigue. So you could give this to somebody who potentially could be tired. Did you sleep last night? How long have you been awake? How long is your shift? How much sleep did you get the previous week? You can ask people for voluntary disclosure. You can do behavioral observation of a coworker, or if somebody thinks somebody's fatigued, they go get their supervisor or their manager, and they can come by and observe the worker, or they can observe it themselves. You can do post-incident investigations, where you look back and see how fatigued was the individual. And you can do fatigue risk assessments, for example, to make sure that individuals aren't doing jobs that are too physically demanding for too long a period of time, or too mundane, that could lead to potential stress. When you're educating people on it, it's awful tough to be able to identify fatigue, but there are things that you can do to create this awareness in people, and mostly it's not because people are able to recognize the signs and symptoms in somebody they don't know, but more like they're able to recognize the signs and symptoms of somebody they know really well. Somebody they've worked with regularly, they can tell when something is different and when they're fatigued, because they know what their basic mannerisms are like. So if they start to see more physical signs like fidgeting and moving around the seat, rubbing their eyes, repeated yawning, staring blankly, long blinks, difficulty keeping their eyes open, and head nodding, those are all pretty good signs that that person's fatigued. Cognitively, they may be out of character. They may be in a negative mood when they're normally a nice person. They could have reduced communication. They could have slips and lapses. They could have poor memory. They could have reduced attention, impaired problem solving, and increased risk taking. And so these are all signs that people can look for cognitively and physically. You can also look at the work environment. You can look at the temperature. You can recognize that if somebody's in a really hot environment, a really cold environment, it's going to be hard and fatiguing for them. If they're in a climate-controlled area, you can make sure that's a comfortable temperature for them, so there's not one extreme or the other, especially when it comes to sleeping. You can make sure appropriate sleeping conditions are there when applicable. You can make sure people have the appropriate PPE, things that are breathable, for example, and glasses that will help block blue light, like this individual who's working on his computer with ergonomics. You can do ergonomic assessments to make people are able to shift postures, and maybe you've got an opportunity to, when you're buying all new office equipment for a brand new location, instead of buying that desk that costs $1,500, it's a sit-down desk, maybe you buy a sit-stand desk that costs the same, and everybody has the option to be able to shift postures throughout the day, because it's not whether you sit or you stand, it's whether you shift postures. And so doing all those different things to be able to mitigate that risk is important. The final thing is Defense 4, which is incident investigation and incident analysis. And this is where you can learn not to make the same mistake again in the future. And so a sample fatigue risk assessment, and this has been coming up throughout the whole talk, this is what we used for it in the offshore, was an employee in conjunction with the supervisor must complete this form. All information in the form is treated as confidential. The employee name, the date and time, the supervisor. In the last 48 hours, they had to put the number of hours slept. Was the sleep quality good or bad? What were the average hours worked over the last 7 days? And how many days consecutively did you work? Over the last 7 days, questions like, do you feel impaired? Can you give a reason for the impairment, fatigue, stress, injury, illness, the effects of alcohol or drugs? When tasks and activities are you expected to perform today? Do you feel safe and effectively perform these duties? Taking into consider higher risk tasks and activities could possibly affect your safety or that of another person. What tasks and activities have been agreed for you to perform today? Do you feel fit to safely perform these tasks? And then look for symptoms of fatigue like chronic tiredness, micro sleeps, headaches, dizziness, appetite loss, blurry vision. And these are for the supervisors to fill out on the individual. And if you can do that, what you've done is you've put together a much more robust and comprehensive approach towards fatigue management that not only takes our traditional fatigue monitoring and management policies and procedures that our organizations may or may not have, but now you're taking into account the circumstances of the individual that's entering your job site before they even arrive. You're looking at things like their health, their sleep hygiene, their mental capacity, and their ability to cope with different aspects of life. You're educating them. You're making sure the environment supports them. You're being sure that stigma and openness around identifying fatigue are front and center, so that individuals, workers, supervisors all can help one another if they experience fatigue. You're educating people, and then you're looking at using risk assessments to be able to identify fatigue in post-incident investigations or prior to high-risk jobs, or after somebody's been flagged as being potentially fatigued on the job site. So these are all things you can apply. I hope this was a new perspective for you and gave you a little bit more of a viewpoint on how fatigue works in the workplace, especially those environments where fatigue is a real challenge, where 24-hour shifts occur, where people have high-stress jobs, they may be in remote sites, and safety is paramount. Thank you very much, and if you need to reach out for any questions or would like any more information, don't hesitate to reach out to me at any time at Mike Wahl at gov.nl.ca. Thank you very much.